They never talk about, they never identify the people who are killed in Palestine, or to use their word, dead in Palestine. They never give their names, they never give their age, they never bring the human dimension of it. It's either numbers or figures, and everything is disputed.
This podcast is supported by Amazing. Amazing is a business that I've followed for the past 3 years, since its early stages, and they empower Muslim customers to buy from Muslim businesses. So whether you're getting married and you need help for a wedding, whether you're a business owner and you need digital marketing services, or whether you just want to do some cupping, Amazing is there to help. So go on their website and choose the service you need and help support the Muslim-friendly businesses. And since the start of the killing in Palestine, they have also put together a list to boycott companies, and I'll also put a link to that. And they've got Coca-Cola on there, they've got Starbucks, Costa Coffee, and they're just a group of young people who are good at tech, and they're doing their best, pooling their resources together to help the cause in Palestine. And 50% of the profits go to Palestine. Welcome to another episode of the I Love Monday podcast. Today we have a special episode not related to business, but more related to the current situation we have in Palestine, and who better than the founder of Friends of Al-Aqsa, Dr. Ismail Adam Patel, to speak us through the history of Palestine, what Friends of Al-Aqsa do, and then the current situation and how we can help. Welcome to the show.
Jazakallah first for inviting me, and assalamu alaikum to you, and assalamu alaikum to all your listeners as well.
So could you tell us a bit of what Friends of Al-Aqsa actually do?
Friends of Al-Aqsa was established 26 years ago. We are an NGO, non-governmental organization, and our duty and maybe responsibilities and objectives are about campaigning, lobbying, educating, protesting, and basically bringing about the plight of the Palestinians to the public and political arena.
Why did you start it?
The start is very strange, in fact. I was invited to visit Palestine in the early 90s. It was accidental. I wasn't supposed to be going there. It was my friend who was invited in a bigger group, but he couldn't attend, so he asked me if I could go. I had never even heard of Palestine, and I couldn't have been able to point it to you on a map where it was. So I went there and it was only for a 3-day trip. So they said, why don't you join them, this group from Leicester, where I live. So I decided to join them. And when I went there, I was shocked for several reasons. That I was a young person, graduated from British University, up and coming business person myself with several businesses as an optometrist. And I thought I knew the world. And when I went there, I realized that how come I wasn't aware that a group of people were occupied. And more than that was the idea of Al-Aqsa. In fact, I remember distinctly when I was taken to the Haram of Al-Aqsa, there were Palestinians telling me about its importance. And I first thought, this guy is maybe just trying to exploit a tourist here. I couldn't believe that was so important. And of course, then I realized, and that dawned upon me, the importance of Masjid Al-Aqsa. And more than that, of course, is the occupation of the Palestinian people. And I come from Africa. I had visited South Africa prior to that, and I had seen apartheid firsthand. And I thought, this is apartheid. How come I was not aware of it? And I suppose that shock coming after the slumber of my own ignorance spurred me to try and educate the people. And that was the very first. And initially I couldn't speak. I wasn't a public speaker. So I first told my few friends and relatives, and they were all also perplexed and quite taken aback of the significance and the plight of the Palestinians. And they said, why don't you have a bigger event? So we had an event, but as I couldn't speak publicly, I had to invite other people. So I had to go and search for Palestinians who could speak about it. And then it sort of went from one stage to another, and then we did a few leaflets, and then somebody said, why don't you have an organization? And then it just grew. So there was never a template or trying to create something. It was organic. It happened because of my experiences and the fact that I was taken. Of course, as Muslim, we believe that it was a blessing for me from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that we should be able to do this.
So from then to now, have your objectives changed in terms of from firstly to educating the masses, now it's more lobbying the government or lobbying the MPs?
Sure. It has expanded rather than, I would say, changed. What has happened is there's more and more responsibilities that we're taking on board and objectives trying to achieve from education, as you mentioned. Lobbying is very, very important, political lobbying in Britain in particularly. And of course, campaigning. And campaigning means trying to address the misinformation about the Palestinians, whether it be in the media, in the educational sector, or the mainstream. So that kind of stuff is also very important. But beyond and above that is, of course, trying to mobilize the community. So for concepts like a boycott and divestment and sanctions, and then protests and other events that are related to Palestine. Like we have something called a Palestine Expo, in which we have tens of thousands of people attend, trying to show the cultural side of Palestine. And of course, then working with university students and other trade unions and other sectors of society, Muslim and non-Muslim. So you can see that the work has expanded over the year, definitely.
You've also written a book about the brief history of Palestine, isn't it?
Sure.
Just to briefly let us know about the history. So going back to the Ottoman times, where Palestine was a thriving economy, and then 1917 happened.
Sure.
What happened in 1917 and how did it happen?
Of course, history is where we want to sort of make an intersection where we begin. So if we begin from the Ottoman Empire, then that region of Palestine was controlled under the Ottoman. There was no state called a Palestine state, but there's definitely a region called Palestine and the people called Palestinians. That does exist. And then in 1917, the British government, the Foreign Secretary rather than the British government, wrote something called the Balfour Declaration. It's a very famous document in which he promises the Jewish people of Europe a homeland in Palestine. Now, there's something very ironic about this, in the sense that this declaration is written by a British Foreign Secretary when Palestine did not belong to Britain. So the Ottoman hadn't surrendered at that stage. And he had not consulted the Palestinians, and he was offering it as a homeland to another people, the European Jews. And this is, of course, an imperialist mindset, that Britain was a superpower of the time, more powerful than America is today, and it thought that it would give anything around the world it liked, the way it liked it, to whom it liked, right? And of course, that document becomes the template upon which the Zionist movement in Europe is galvanized. And it is shown to, once Britain then occupies Palestine from the Ottoman Empire, it becomes a template for the Zionist movement to move the European Jews and try and create a homeland in Palestine. But what is very significant, between 1917 and up till mid-1930s, the European Jews would not accept the Zionist movement, as in taking the Jews out of Europe and transporting them to Palestine, because majority of them thought that it is better for them to try and resist the anti-Semitism, the discrimination internally, and try and find a way out. And Zionist as a movement and as an option was not entertained. In fact, many Jewish Board of Deputies right across Europe, Austria, Hungary, even Germany, even Britain, up until 1939, refused to accept the Zionist option, meaning taking the Jews out of Europe and putting them into Palestine, because they understood that if they try to do that, there is an indigenous people that existence there, and it would not be possible to create a homeland there apart from expelling the indigenous people. And of course, the situation changes because of the Second World War. Nazi Germany comes into power and the Holocaust. And so those horrors meant that what was now the only option left for them was to move out of Europe and shift into Palestine. And this was also facilitated by the European and the Allied powers, because they refused to take the refugees from Germany. Yeah, and this is very interesting, that while Britain was trying to shift the Zionists and the Jews of Europe into Palestine, Britain itself would not allow Jewish refugees from Germany or wider Europe to come in and settle here. And if you look at the newspapers of the late 1920s and early 30s, the language used against the Jewish people mirrors the same language that is being used against the refugees today. You know, as if the outsiders are coming in, they're going to take our resources, our jobs, they're going to bring the country down. All those negative tropes that are used against refugees today was used against the Jewish people in the 1920s and 30s.
And then the Jewish refugees moved into Palestine in 1942, and for a good number of years they were living peacefully, right?
No, the problem here is, and it starts very early on, because the Zionist movement, right from the beginning, its objective was to create a state. So when they were taking Jewish communities, the refugees, and those who are also ideologically inclined to creating this state. So there's two types of people here. One, of course, the refugees and the discriminated people in Europe, the Jewish community, and those who are ideologically inclined to thinking of creating a state. As soon as they moved into Palestine, they created their own enclaves. They wanted to create their own state, so they wanting to be independent. Whatever they did was to do within themselves. So they isolated themselves from the Palestinians. They did not go into Palestine as refugees. And this is a big distinction. And of course, during this time, Britain is controlling Palestine. Britain has the mandate over Palestine. And Britain is allowing them to create what are known as kibbutz, own enclaves, independent little villages and cities and towns, in which Britain is helping them to facilitate that and embed them within the territory, if you like. And of course, then 1947, after the war, what happens is there two battalions, the Zionist battalions, are trained by Britain. They actually see action, and they have their own flag within the British Army during the Second World War. So they're very, very powerful. And they're now in a rush to create their own state. So they'll start even attacking the British at that stage now, towards the end, immediately after the Second World War. In fact, several British officers are killed. They bomb King David Hospital in Jerusalem. I think Wiseman, yes, in particularly, is then by the British government is considered as a terrorist and as a wanted individual in Britain. So there's a change in dynamics. So what Britain does at that stage is it abandons Palestine, and it says, this problem is too much for us. But by then it had already made the Zionist movement so powerful, both economically, militarily, that when they abandon Palestine, what they say, we'll give it to the United Nations. Now the United Nations can take care of it. But remembering that the United Nations is just being formed immediately after the second. So it's a very young body which is being formed by America and Britain as pivotal players, and a few other, of course, European countries. So they're the pivotal players in forming the United Nations. And Britain says, you know what, the Palestinian issue has to be dealt with by the United Nations. And they leave Palestine, mandate Palestine. The United Nations, what it does is, without consulting the Palestinians, it does not ask them what they want. With the pressure from America and Britain and few European countries, decide to petition Palestine. The Palestinians were, of course, shocked and taken aback. We've been living here for thousands of years. This is our home. A body in America, this new body called the United Nations, is now saying we should give away something like 58% of the land, when these refugees don't even own 7% of the land. So at that stage, in 47, 48, the Zionist movement did not even own 7% of the territory. Yet the United Nations says, 58% has to go to them and create a state of Israel. The Palestinians refused. But at that stage, militarily, the Zionist movement was very powerful. And they were, of course, silently being backed by Britain as well, and the powers to be at the time. Then you have what's known as the Nakba, or what the Israelis call the War of Independence between 47 and 48, in which the Zionist movement then ethnically cleansed 531 Palestinian villages. 70% of Palestinians are made refugees. And those refugees are refugees even today. And they now account to something like 7 million refugees. They have never been able to come back to their homes. And instead of 58%, 78% of mandate Palestine is then occupied by the new Zionist movement. And the state of Israel then emerges at the end of a barrel of a gun. We must understand this, that the state of Israel does not emerge through the United Nations as how it's been sort of portrayed. It emerges at the end of the barrel of the gun through the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians, through the creating of refugees. Yeah? And the other important factor here is that when United Nations accepts Israel as a state, it accepts it on the condition of a UN Resolution 194, that we accept that Israel is a state, but it must abide by UN Resolution 194. And that resolution states that every Palestinian who was expelled during 47, 48, the refugees, have a right of return. And that resolution has been enacted over 150 times, the last time I looked, over 150 times. yet Israel has not abided by it.
Why did United Nations give 58% of Palestine to Israel at that point? What was their reasoning behind it?
The reasoning is, of course, the horrors of the Second World War was one of the reasoning. And I think that is the main catalyst that moved the world to the sympathy to the Jewish people. I mean, you would have to be moved, when they had 6 million people massacred, we have a Holocaust taking place, people were moved. But the injustices that was being carried out on the indigenous people was not looked at, and that was rather overlooked. And what was failed here is the fact to ask the people who moved from Nazi Germany to live as equals with indigenous Palestinians. And that was not looked at. And of course, the narrative was, at this stage, the Bible was used, that the Jews were originally from Palestine, which they were. But that was, the time of Prophet Dawood and Prophet Sulaiman al-Islam. So we're going back 3,500 years ago, and using that as a mandate. And of course, you can't use any religious text as a title deed to property. Otherwise, Muslims, our Quran says everything has been created by Allah and belongs to Muslims. And it's Allah's land. We can't go around using the Quran, going around the world saying, look, the Quran says this is our property. But they use that text. So they use that as to their advantage, the Zionists did. And then, of course, the sympathy of the world to the survivors of the Holocaust. And those factors. And of course, there's a third factor of the geopolitics, that what they saw in particularly Britain, if you look at Balfour's thinking, that he is an anti-Semite himself. I mean, this is very well recorded. And the reason he wants to help the Zionist movement, because he saw this as a colonialist enterprise. He saw that by planting the Zionist entity and creating this state of Israel that would emerge, that would be beneficial to the powers be. At that time, Britain as imperial power, and then America saw it like that as well. That, by having Israel there will be beneficial for their colonialist enterprise. So there is that colonialist element as well.
What's the difference between Zionists and Jews? Because some people put them as one, but of course they're two separate groups essentially.
Absolutely. Not all Jews are Zionists, and not all Zionists are Jews. Okay. There is a I won't say very big, but there's a significant number of Jews who are adamantly against Zionism, even today. Particularly the Naturai Karta is a sect within the Jewish community who are completely against the Zionism. And there's, of course, non-Jews. So even now, if you look at some of the political leaders in Europe who are not Jews, but they will support Israel because they believe in this colonialist enterprise. They believe in the right of the colonialist authority, of their superiority over the indigenous people. So it's a political ideology. Zionism is a political ideology, and we shouldn't mix it up with a faith Judaism. They are two completely distinct things.
So if we fast forward to, let's say, 20 years ago, there was quite a few wars. They've had wars with Egypt, Jordan, and then things kind of settled down. But the settlements continued. Mm-hmm. And then, I think, about 17 years ago when they continued bombing Gaza and the West Bank.
Sure. So if we the main junctures within the history between 47 and present day is, of course, the 1967 war, in which then Israel occupies what was the remaining 22% of Palestine, which was West Bank on the right-hand side and Gaza Strip. Now, the Gaza is very interesting, that Gaza was twice its original size that we see today. And in 47, Israel had occupied, so it reduced it to the size we see it. And most of the people in Gaza are refugees. And if you think about it, where did these refugees come from? They came from the wider, bigger Gaza. And so today, when people in Gaza, they look across that wall that Israel has built, they can see their homeland. They can see their villages. They can see the land where the fathers owned and cultivated. And so cities like Ashdod and Ashkelon, they're part of original Gaza. And people can relate to that. That was our home. So that's something we need to understand. And of course, in West Bank, when they occupied it in 1967, they started expanding settlements within that. And there's something like 250,000, if my figures are correct, near to that, settlers within West Bank. It has got something like 650 checkpoints. There's a wall that goes around cities. It's not a straight line wall. It goes from one city to another, encircling each Palestinian village and city.
In the West Bank.
In the West Bank. So it's cutting off one area from the other. So, for example, it is extremely difficult for somebody living in, say, Nablus to go to Ramallah because they have to go through so many checkpoints. It might be 30, 40 miles away, but it would take them a day to travel. So that has been totally fractured. The whole of West Bank has been fractured. And of course, within the West Bank, the Palestinians are deprived of water, the right of movement because of the checkpoints, and basic human necessities. So, for example, in the city of Kalkilia, which has one entrance and exit point, all the Palestinians need to use that. And that entrance and exit point is open at the behest of the Israeli soldiers. So one day they could open it between 9 and 5, the next day it could be 9 and 1. So if you just imagine, if you had an appointment outside the city, or if you have your work that takes you outside the city, or you have your farm that's outside the city, so you go out, but by the time you come back, if it's closed, you have to stay outside. There's no way you can go back to your home.
Where do they stay? Just
They stay outside either the wall or, this is the daily misery that the Palestinians have to go through. And that this has been going on for decades. And this is what we need to understand, that the crisis of the Palestinians started from the time Britain occupied it from the Ottomans, but it got worse during the 47-48 war. And of course, it absolutely became catastrophic after the 1967 war. And that is why major international organizations like Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, the United Nations, Beit Salem, which is an Israeli organization, actually, a Jewish organization, all of them consider that Israel is practicing apartheid, this discrimination, the racism against the Palestinian people.
Your organization has expanded, as you said, to lobby the MPs, but do you also do aid work there?
No, we don't. We in Britain, if you do charitable work, then you're not allowed to do political campaign.
So
and there's a clear division of labor, if you like, in Britain. So we are not a registered charity, we are an NGO. In fact, we are registered with the United Nations, in which we are the representative of the Palestinian people in the diaspora, meaning from outside Palestine.
How many times have you been to Palestine?
I've only been twice. The last time I was allowed to go in was in 2000, so that's 23 years ago. I tried to go again on the Mavi Marmara, the flotilla, if you recall.
Turkish one.
The Turkish flotilla, that's right. It was, although it originated from Turkey, it had international passengers in it from right across Europe, Africa, and also Asia. We were trying to take aid to Gaza and try and break the siege of Gaza, because the siege of Gaza started in 2007, and Israel is controlling the land, the water, and the air. So we thought, the one way to help them is to take aid through a ship which could take a large quantity. Unfortunately, we were attacked by the Israeli Navy. That was in 2010, and taken as prisoners to Israel.
How long were you taken as prisoner for?
A couple of days, not for very long, but it took the international community and the Turkish government to help for release and go back.
Were there not about 9 people?
9 people were killed by the Israelis as well. They were shot while we were in there, and of course that was very, very painful, because I was one of the individuals trying to help and get aid to them, first aid.
And you mentioned that that's the last time you were allowed to go in is 2000, so now you can't go in? Or?
Yes, I've been banned from 2000, I think. They refused entry to me and not to go back.
What's the reason?
The reason is basically I highlight the plight of the Palestinian people. There's no other reason. Because you want to talk about it, you want to bring about justice. It is really, we live in a very strange world, Brother Zayed, that those who want to ask for peace and justice, those who want to uphold international law, are somehow seen as radical and fundamentalist and extremist. Yet those who want to do the occupation, the subjugation of people, the flagrant violation of law, they are somehow seen as the people who are, conducive to be seen with. Should we put it that way?
I think that's one of the things that you lead on when you speak at the marches. There's no justice, there's no peace, and for the masses, the media is terribly one-sided.
Sure.
And in this particular instance, since the 7th of October, we've had so much information on social media, and the media is saying one thing and social media says the other thing.
Absolutely.
And we've had organisations like BBC saying the Palestinian marches, the ones that you've organised, are for Hamas when they weren't. They were for Palestine, for the freedom of Palestine. How do you set about trying to control that narrative?
There's several things. First thing, let me say why this is happening. I mean, this is a process of dehumanization. I think it's a strategic approach where, in particularly the elites, the institutional of the BBC in particular, and in fact, I would say even our government, are trying to undermine the Palestinian cause. And the one way of doing it is to equate them to fundamentalist groups and terrorist groups. So what you do is you identify one group here. For example, Hamas has been identified as terrorist. So all Palestinians are Hamas, and therefore anything related to that are terrorist. So anybody trying to then, in reverse, supporting the Palestinians, you're a terrorist. So you can see how this sort of quite easily fits into that narrative. And what we have to try and do is, of course, show by evidence. Now, anybody who has been to our demonstrations, the first time, 2 weeks ago, we had 150,000. Last week, we had 300,000. There was not a single chant for terrorism. There's no single chant for violence. We are asking to end violence. We are asking for ceasefire. We are asking to end the siege of Gaza. Yeah. So when that is equated as violence, then I think most people who attend this, and in particularly now the social media, is the force that is countering, if you like, quote unquote, the mainstream narrative. And the mainstream, I think, is in trouble because in the past, they were the main channel, the go-to place for people to get information. It no longer is. People are actually going there as a secondary source to see how biased they are. So to just think about the language that, in particularly, that BBC is using. In the past 2 weeks, it has been saying that Palestinians have died, right? Whereas the Israelis are killed. Dying is a natural process. Also, they're talking about Israel being bombed, whereas there's explosions in Gaza. They never identify the people who are killed in Palestine, or to use their word, dead in Palestine. They never give their names, they never give their age, they never bring the human dimension of it. It's either numbers or figures, and everything is disputed. So Palestinians say this, but Israel doesn't agree to it. And more worrying than that has been the two hostages that have been released recently. The old lady, I forget her name, and Yasmin Parrot. She was released earlier. Now, if you look not on just social media, which may be docked, let's put that aside. But if you look other mainstream media like Al Jazeera and other international media, you realize you almost schizophrenic. You don't know what to believe here, because in one part they're saying, despite the fact that they were taken, of course, that is a great anxiety and great concern, but how they were treated and the fact that they were released, they were saying, they were reasonable to us under the circumstances. Yeah. Yet how it's portrayed on the BBC as if they've been harassed, that they've been physically attacked, and all these other dimensions of emotions that are aroused against the Palestinians. And that, of course, makes a lot of young people try to look other sources. And I think this is, in a way, this is not helpful for us in Britain. Because when you have our mainstream channel trying to portray this conflict in a biased perspective, it loses credibility for other stuff. And it's not good for the country, it's not good for the people, because they will always be looking. And this is where, unfortunately, the conspiracy theories comes in, and those who are creating other material that are definitely not true, then are hooked upon by the masses. But the problem starts by the mainstream, because they are the established people. They should be able to provide investigative journalism and objective journalism. It appears to me that all the necessity of a journalist, being objective, being investigative, being able to report with evidence, goes out of the window when they're covering the issue of Palestine. The rest of the time they try to use it, but not when it's to do with Palestine.
It's like when there was that Reuters journalist who was killed by Israeli airstrikes. Reuters themselves did not mention he got killed by Israeli airstrikes, right. Just airstrikes. Mm. Or there's CNN and other media companies where they show that the journalist is taking cover, or the reporter is taking cover, and there's people walking past.
That's right.
And on social media, people can see that. Whereas the older generation, maybe where they just watch the news, they might not see the full picture. But because the younger generation are more looking more and more in depth, then they can generally see the wider picture. But then what also happens, like you said, confusion, because one is reporting one side, the others report the other side, and there's complete different and opposing views and opposing information for one event. How do we combat that?
Well, we have to look at what the objectives of, I think what youngsters, in particular young people, are doing is they're understanding where the source is coming from. And that is, in a way, this is what I was saying, it's unhealthy. Because if it's coming from something like BBC, people are considering it as immediately suspect, and they will then go and check it. They want to fact check it, which is in a way good. But it also undermines the whole thing. So what we need to do is to have reliable sources from the ground who have been authenticated and other outlets.
The mainstream media are very much on edge, and they're putting people on edge rather, in terms of there's plenty of anti-Semitic attacks. At the same time, we've seen in Chicago there's been Islamophobic attacks. This indicates that it's a Muslim issue and a Jewish issue. But is it a Muslim versus Jew, or is it something completely different?